Sometimes the people we ignore the longest are the ones holding the last pieces of our humanity. Rain slid slowly down the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Cathedral, while Ethan Calloway stood motionless beside his mother's casket, his black wool coat still damp from the storm outside. Manhattan's elite filled every pew in silence. Politicians, investors, old money families with silver hair and quiet voices. The kind of people who lowered their heads respectfully when Ethan walked by, not because they loved him, but because his name controlled too many buildings, too many companies, too many futures. The organ played softly somewhere above the cathedral ceiling, but Ethan barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on the small white envelope resting beside Margaret Calloway's folded hands. It hadn't been there during the viewing earlier that morning. Someone must have placed it there moments before the ceremony began. His mother's elegant handwriting curved gently across the front. Ethan, for a moment, he simply stared at it. Strange how death could reduce an empire to paper and silence. A week ago, Margaret Calloway had still been alive, sitting beneath the golden lamp in her Fifth Avenue penthouse, sipping Earl Grey tea while pretending not to notice her son answering emails during dinner. Now the woman who once filled entire rooms with warmth existed only in memories and handwritten notes. The funeral director gave him a subtle nod. Ethan reached forward slowly and picked up the envelope. The paper felt lighter than it should have. Around him, cameras flashed softly from the back rows where reporters pretended to be respectful. He ignored them. His fingers unfolded the letter carefully. One sentence. That was all she left him. Ask the waitress why I forgave you. Ethan frowned immediately. The waitress? His eyes scanned the line again. There had to be another page. Another explanation. But there wasn't. Just those 7 words written in fading blue ink. Ask the waitress why I forgave you. A cold heaviness settled quietly behind his ribs. Forgave him for what? And what waitress? Beside him, the family attorney adjusted his glasses nervously. Mr. Calloway, he whispered gently, the guests are waiting for your speech. Ethan folded the letter once. Then again, his jaw tightened slightly. Cancel it. Sir. The speech. His voice remained calm, but distant now. Cancel it. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above the city skyline. The cathedral doors opened as guests slowly began leaving their seats, black umbrellas unfolding like shadows in the rain. Ethan barely noticed them. His mind had already gone somewhere else. A waitress. The word echoed strangely in his head while fragments of memory drifted past like reflections on dark water. Coffee cups. Morning meetings. A small cafe beneath Calloway Tower where he stopped almost every day without thinking. A quiet blonde woman in a cream-colored apron. Soft eyes. Simple smile. Invisible. His stomach tightened unexpectedly. No, it couldn't be her. He didn't even know her name. The realization hit harder than he expected. 5 years. He had been visiting that cafe for almost 5 years. Same table. Same order. Same woman bringing his coffee every morning at exactly 7:15. And he had never once asked her name. Ethan slipped the letter into his coat pocket and walked down the cathedral aisle alone while mourners parted silently around him. The marble floors reflected the pale glow of chandelier light beneath his polished shoes. Somewhere behind him, someone called his name softly, but he kept walking. Rain hammered against the city as soon as he stepped outside. Black SUVs lined the curb. Drivers waited with umbrellas ready. The usual machinery of wealth and control. Yet for the first time in years, Ethan felt strangely disconnected from all of it. The driver opened the back door immediately. Home, sir. Ethan stared out at the gray Manhattan streets for several quiet seconds. Water rushed along the sidewalks. People hurried beneath umbrellas without looking at one another. Invisible lives crossing invisible lives. Then he spoke softly. Take me to Bennett's Cafe. The driver blinked once in surprise. The cafe under headquarters, sir? Yes. The car moved slowly through midtown traffic while Ethan rested his head back against the leather seat. His mother's final sentence kept replaying in his mind with unbearable precision. Ask the waitress why I forgave you. Not why she forgave you. Why I forgave you. Meaning his mother believed he had done something wrong long before her death. Something serious enough to need forgiveness. But what? His fingers tightened unconsciously around the letter inside his coat pocket. The city lights blurred softly against the rain-covered windows while memories surfaced one by one. His mother canceling dinners because she was busy. his assistant mentioning she had lunch downtown every Thursday. The faint scent of coffee on her clothes sometimes when he visited her apartment. Strange details he had ignored because he was too busy building acquisitions worth billions of dollars. Too busy turning himself into the kind of man who measured time in contracts and percentages instead of conversations. 20 minutes later, the SUV stopped beside the curb outside Bennett's Cafe. Warm yellow light glowed through fogged windows. Inside, customers sat quietly beneath hanging lamps while jazz music drifted softly through the glass. Ethan stared at the entrance without moving. Then he saw her. The waitress stood behind the counter arranging ceramic cups carefully onto a tray. Blonde hair tied loosely back. Cream-colored sweater beneath her apron. Calm expression. Familiar movements. And suddenly, for reasons he could not explain, the entire world seemed to slow down. Because for the first time in 5 years, Ethan Calloway looked at her like a human being instead of part of the furniture. The small bell above the cafe door chimed softly as Ethan stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of rain and cold Manhattan air. Warm light wrapped around the room immediately. The place smelled like cinnamon, roasted coffee beans, and fresh bread from the bakery case near the register. Quiet jazz drifted through hidden speakers while people sat beneath hanging amber lamps, speaking in low voices that blended gently with the sound of ceramic cups touching saucers. It was strange. Ethan had been inside Bennett's Cafe hundreds of times before, yet this was the first time he noticed any of it. Clara looked up from behind the counter the moment the door closed. For a brief second, surprise crossed her face. Then it disappeared beneath the same calm expression she always wore. "Good evening, Mr. Calloway," she said softly. Her voice carried the same quiet steadiness he remembered from every rushed morning before meetings. "You are here later than usual." Ethan did not answer immediately. Rainwater slid slowly from the shoulders of his black coat onto the dark hardwood floor while he stared at her more carefully than he ever had before. She looked younger than he remembered, or maybe simply more human now that he was actually paying attention. Pale blonde hair rested loosely against her shoulders, slightly curled at the ends from the humidity outside. Her cream sweater sleeves were folded neatly to her elbows beneath the cafe apron, revealing slender hands marked faintly by tiny burns and years of handling hot cups. Not polished hands. Working hands. "We are closing in 20 minutes, Clara added gently when he remained silent. Ethan glanced around the cafe. Half the chairs had already been flipped upside down onto tables. A college student typed quietly near the back window while an older couple shared pie beneath the glow of a hanging lamp. Normal people. Living ordinary evenings while his world felt like it had cracked open sometime between the funeral and this moment. "My mother used to come here," he said finally. Clara's hands paused for the smallest fraction of a second. Then she nodded once. Yes. That single word settled heavily in the air between them. Ethan stepped closer to the counter slowly. "How long?" Clara reached for a towel and wiped the espresso machine carefully before answering. "Almost 4 years." For years. Ethan felt something cold move quietly through his chest. 4 years meant his mother had been visiting this cafe while he was traveling between boardrooms, investor dinners, and conferences he barely remembered now. 4 years of conversations happening beneath this roof while he remained completely unaware. Why? The question sounded smaller than he intended. Clara looked toward the rain-covered windows for a moment before speaking. At first, because she liked the tea. Ethan almost laughed at how absurdly simple the answer sounded. His mother owned penthouses overlooking Central Park. She could have hired private chefs from Paris if she wanted to. Yet somehow she had chosen this small cafe tucked beneath his office tower. Clara continued folding napkins carefully while speaking. Then she stayed because nobody here treated her like Margaret Calloway. Ethan frowned slightly. What does that mean? Clara gave a faint smile, though sadness rested quietly behind it. Most people spoke to her like she was your last name. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. Outside, headlights blurred through the rain beyond the cafe windows while silence stretched softly between them. Clara moved naturally around the counter, turning chairs upright, collecting empty cups, finishing small closing tasks with quiet efficiency. Ethan noticed how peaceful her movements were. Nothing rushed, nothing desperate to impress. She existed with the kind of calm people only carried after surviving difficult things alone. "She talked about me?" he asked quietly. Clara hesitated this time. Not long, but enough for Ethan to notice. Sometimes. What did she say? Clara looked down at the porcelain cup she was drying in her hands. That you work too much. Ethan exhaled softly through his nose. That sounds like her. She said you stopped sleeping properly around age 30. Ethan blinked once. Clara continued before he could answer. She said you forgot your own birthday 3 years in a row. His jaw tightened slightly. She told you all that. People tell the truth easier to strangers. The cafe grew quieter as the last customers left into the storm outside. Clara walked toward the front door and flipped the sign from open to closed before locking it gently. Ethan remained standing near the counter, strangely unable to leave. He should have been at the penthouse speaking with lawyers or reviewing memorial arrangements. Instead, he found himself watching a waitress lower window shades beneath warm yellow light while his mother's final letter burned quietly inside his coat pocket. Clara returned to the counter carrying a ceramic cup. Steam curled softly upward. Earl Grey tea. 1 spoon of honey. Exactly the way Margaret drank it. She placed it in front of him without speaking. Ethan stared down at the cup slowly. His throat tightened unexpectedly. She sat there every Thursday, Clara said softly, nodding toward the small corner table near the window. Always around 6 o'clock. Ethan looked toward the table. A simple place. Nothing special. Just soft light and rain against glass. He tried suddenly to imagine his mother sitting there alone while the city moved around her unnoticed. The image hurt more than he expected. Why did she write about you in her letter? Clara's expression changed almost invisibly at the question. Sadness flickered briefly through her eyes before settling again into composure. Then, without answering, she reached beneath the counter and carefully placed a white porcelain cup in front of him. Different from the others. Older. Faint crack near the handle. Ethan recognized it immediately. His mother's favorite cup. Clara turned it slowly until words written beneath the base faced upward. Ethan lowered his eyes. His breath caught instantly. In faded blue ink, written unmistakably in Margaret Calloway's handwriting, were 5 quiet words. She listened when you did not. Ethan stared at the words beneath the porcelain cup while the sound of rain tapped softly against the cafe windows behind him. She listened when you did not. The blue ink had faded slightly over time, but his mother's handwriting remained unmistakable. Elegant, calm, careful, even in old age. His fingers rested against the edge of the counter, as if he suddenly needed something solid to hold on to. Clara said nothing. She simply stood quietly beneath the warm cafe lights, giving silence room to breathe instead of rushing to fill it. Ethan swallowed slowly. When did she write this? Clara folded the towel in her hands once before answering. About 8 months ago. 8 months. Meaning Margaret had known her time was becoming limited long before anyone told Ethan the truth. The realization settled heavily inside him. He remembered the phone calls he had ignored because of meetings, the dinners he rescheduled, the vacations he promised to plan later. Later suddenly felt like the cruelest word in the English language. Ethan lowered himself slowly into the chair beside the counter. The same corner table his mother used every Thursday remained visible near the rain-covered window. A small brass lamp cast soft amber light across the empty seat where she once sat for hours talking to a waitress her son barely noticed existed. Clara moved quietly toward the espresso machine and turned it off for the night. The sudden absence of its low humming sound made the cafe feel even quieter. She talked to you about personal things? Ethan asked finally. Clara nodded faintly. Sometimes. Why? Clara looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because I listened. There was no accusation in her voice. Somehow that made it hurt more. Ethan leaned back slowly, exhaustion settling into his shoulders for the first time all day. At the funeral, he had shaken hands with senators and billionaires without feeling anything. But sitting here beneath soft cafe lights with a dead woman's teacup in front of him suddenly felt unbearable. Did she ever mention being unhappy? Clara's expression softened almost invisibly. Not unhappy. She paused gently. Lonely. The word lingered between them. Ethan looked down immediately. Outside, headlights drifted across wet Manhattan streets while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas, invisible behind streaks of rain. I gave her everything, he said quietly, almost to himself. The apartment. Nurses. Drivers. Security. Vacations. Clara nodded once. I know. Then why was she lonely? Clara walked toward the window and adjusted the shades slightly before turning back toward him. Because none of those things sat beside her when she was scared at 2 in the morning. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Her words landed with devastating precision because somewhere deep down, he already knew they were true. His mother used to call late sometimes. He remembered seeing her name appear across his phone during flights, meetings, charity events. He would text her afterward. Busy right now. I will call tomorrow. Tomorrow had eventually stopped coming. Clara returned to the counter and carefully stacked clean cups in silence. Ethan watched her movements again. Steady, unhurried, like someone who understood that small things mattered. How did you meet her? Clara smiled faintly, though sadness touched her eyes. By accident. Ethan looked up. Clara rested one hand lightly against the counter while remembering. It was snowing that day. February, I think. Your mother slipped outside the pharmacy across the street. Ethan's attention sharpened instantly. She fell. Not badly. Mostly frightened. Clara glanced toward the dark window. People walked around her because they were in a hurry. Shame moved quietly through Ethan's chest. Manhattan. A city full of millions of people too busy to stop for one frightened old woman. You helped her. Clara nodded simply. I waited with her until the driver arrived. And after that she started coming here? The next week. A faint smile touched Clara's lips now, softer than before. She complained that our tea was terrible. Ethan almost laughed unexpectedly. It escaped him before he could stop it. Short, quiet, human. Clara noticed the sound and smiled properly for the first time that evening. She said Americans destroy tea with microwaves. Ethan shook his head slowly. That sounds exactly like her. Silence settled again, but this time gentler somehow. Less sharp around the edges. Clara reached beneath the counter once more and removed a small leather notebook tied carefully with faded ribbon. Ethan recognized it immediately. His mother carried it everywhere. She asked me to give you this someday, Clara said softly. Ethan stared at the notebook without touching it. What is it? I never opened it. Clara placed it carefully beside the teacup. She said you would know when you were ready. Ethan finally reached for the notebook. The leather felt worn smooth beneath his fingers from years of use. Inside, pages brimmed with Margaret's elegant handwriting. Notes, thoughts, small memories, grocery lists beside poetry fragments, observations about weather and strangers and loneliness. His throat tightened as he turned another page. Then his eyes stopped suddenly. Every Thursday entry ended with the same line written carefully at the bottom. Talked with Clara today. Felt less alone afterward. Ethan stared at the sentence while emotion rose quietly and unexpectedly inside his chest. Not dramatic grief. Not tears. Something heavier. The slow, unbearable realization that his mother had found comfort in conversations with a waitress because her own son had become too busy to notice she needed him. He closed the notebook carefully. Across from him, Clara lowered the cafe lights one by one until only the soft lamps near the counter remained glowing. Warm gold against the darkness outside. Ethan looked at her differently now. Not invisible anymore. Not background noise beside expensive mornings. She had become the final witness to parts of his mother he failed to protect. And somehow, without meaning to, that quiet waitress had already begun exposing the emptiness inside a man who once believed success could replace presence. The rain had stopped by the time Ethan finally stepped out of Bennett's cafe, but the city still glistened beneath the pale midnight lights of Manhattan. Water shimmered across the sidewalks like broken glass, while yellow taxis moved slowly through the streets below Callaway Tower. Ethan stood beneath the cafe awning for several quiet seconds with Margaret's leather notebook tucked beneath his arm. Above him, 48 floors of office windows stretched into the dark sky like cold squares of artificial light. His empire. Normally the sight grounded him. Tonight it felt strangely hollow. The driver hurried toward him with an umbrella already open. Sir, should I take you home? Ethan looked once more through the cafe window before answering. Clara was still inside, turning chairs upside down onto tables beneath warm golden lamps. Small movements. Simple routines. Somehow more real than the entire world waiting upstairs in boardrooms and marble offices. No, Ethan said quietly. Take me to the office. The black SUV slid silently through wet streets while the city moved around him in reflections and shadows. Ethan opened his mother's notebook again beneath the dim interior light. More pages. More Thursdays. More small observations he had never known existed. Clara says rain makes lonely people honest. Clara brought me soup when I forgot to eat. She remembers details nobody else notices. Ethan stared at the handwriting while something inside him tightened painfully. Margaret had spent years recording tiny moments with a waitress because those moments mattered to her. Meanwhile, Ethan could barely remember his mother's last birthday dinner without checking his calendar. The realization followed him all the way into the underground parking garage beneath Callaway Tower. Midnight silence filled the executive floor when the elevator doors opened. Most employees had gone home hours earlier, leaving only the faint hum of climate control systems and distant cleaning crews somewhere below. Ethan walked slowly through the dark hallway lined with framed magazine covers celebrating his success. America's youngest billion-dollar CEO. Wall Street titan. Visionary of the decade. Tonight the photographs felt almost embarrassing. He entered his office without turning on the overhead lights. The Manhattan skyline glowed through floor-to-ceiling windows behind his desk, while soft city reflections stretched across polished marble floors. Ethan loosened his tie slowly and sat down in silence. His eyes drifted automatically toward the digital calendar glowing on his computer screen. Meetings, acquisitions, investor calls, dinners, flights, endless blocks of scheduled importance. Then his gaze stopped. Thursdays. Every Thursday evening for nearly 4 years, his assistant had repeatedly blocked off 2 hours labeled personal time for Margaret Callaway. Ethan frowned slightly. He did not remember scheduling that. He reached for the office phone immediately. "Lauren," he said when his assistant answered sleepily after 2 rings. "I need access to my mother's visitor logs." Silence. Then confusion. "Right now, sir." Right now. 20 minutes later, Ethan stood alone in the building's security office reviewing archived camera footage from the previous years. Black and white video flickered across multiple screens while a tired security manager adjusted playback settings nervously beside him. "We archive footage every 30 days unless requested otherwise," the manager explained carefully. "But your mother's private access permissions automatically preserved certain files." Ethan barely listened. His attention remained fixed on the monitor. There she was, Margaret Callaway, stepping slowly out of a Blacktown car outside Bennett's Café almost every Thursday evening. Same cream coat, same silver scarf, same gentle smile as Clara opened the cafe door for her each time. Ethan watched silently while weeks turned into months across the footage. The pattern never changed. His mother arrived around 6, left around 8, sometimes laughing softly beside Clara near the counter before heading home, sometimes simply sitting quietly with tea while the waitress listened across the table. Ethan felt something painful move through his chest while watching one particular recording from winter. Snow fell heavily outside the cafe windows while Margaret sat bundled in her scarf, speaking animatedly. Clara listened without interrupting, smiling warmly while pouring fresh tea. Then suddenly Margaret reached across the table and squeezed the younger woman's hand gently. The gesture was small, maternal, familiar. Ethan froze. "Pause that," he said quietly. The image stopped immediately. Ethan stared at the frozen screen longer than he intended, because his mother looked happy. Not politely happy for charity galas or board dinners. Truly happy. The kind of happiness that softened a person's entire face. He realized with quiet horror that he had not seen that expression in years. "Sir?" the security manager asked carefully. Ethan did not answer at first. His eyes remained fixed on the monitor while another realization settled slowly inside him. His mother had not hidden these visits. He simply never noticed them. He had spent years moving through life surrounded by assistants, schedules, private elevators, and polished routines that insulated him from ordinary human attention. People became functions, employees, service staff, background movement around his success, including Clara. Especially Clara. "Can you zoom in?" Ethan asked softly. The manager adjusted the footage carefully. Clara's face filled more of the screen now. Ethan noticed details he had ignored for years. The exhaustion beneath her eyes after long shifts. The way she leaned forward fully when listening to Margaret speak. The quiet patience in her posture. She never once looked distracted. Never once checked a phone. Never once seemed eager for the conversation to end. Ethan looked down suddenly. Shame arrived quietly, not dramatic, but suffocating in its honesty. His mother had found emotional safety with a waitress because her own son had become emotionally unavailable behind layers of money and ambition. The thought sat heavily in the silence around him. Then the security manager cleared his throat gently. "There is one more thing, sir." Ethan glanced up. The older man hesitated before pulling another file onto the screen. "About 6 months ago, your mother requested permanent authorization access for Miss Bennett." Ethan frowned slightly. Authorization for what? The manager clicked open the document. Ethan's eyes scanned the line once. Then again. His pulse slowed instantly. Margaret Calloway had legally granted Clara Bennett emergency medical decision access during her final hospital stay. Not her son. Not the board attorneys. Clara. Ethan stared at the screen while the city lights flickered faintly beyond the glass windows behind him. Somewhere deep inside the towering silence of Calloway Tower, the most powerful man in the building finally began understanding how completely he had failed the woman who loved him most. The city looked different at 4 in the morning. Manhattan no longer felt loud or untouchable beneath the pale blue glow before sunrise. The streets below Calloway Tower sat unusually quiet, washed clean by the night rain, while steam drifted lazily from underground vents into the cold air. Ethan remained alone in his office with Margaret's notebook open across his desk, and the security footage paused silently on the screen beside him. Clara and his mother sat frozen mid-conversation beneath the warm cafe lights, smiling at something he would never hear. Ethan loosened his collar slowly and rubbed both hands across his face. Exhaustion pressed heavily behind his eyes now, but sleep felt impossible. Every page of Margaret's notebook seemed to reveal another version of her life he had never bothered to notice. Another quiet moment given to someone else because he had not made space for it himself. His phone buzzed softly against the desk. "Lauren again." "Sir," his assistant said carefully the moment he answered. "The board moved tomorrow's meeting to 9 o'clock due to the memorial coverage." Ethan stared at the frozen security image while speaking quietly. "Cancel my schedule." Silence. "All of it. Everything." Lauren hesitated. "Sir, the Japan acquisition alone has already been delayed twice." Ethan's eyes drifted back toward his mother's handwriting beside him. "Then delay it again." Another silence followed, heavier this time. Because Ethan Calloway never canceled meetings, never delayed acquisitions, never stepped away from control. Yet something inside him had shifted tonight in ways even he could not fully understand. "Understood," Lauren said softly before ending the call. Ethan remained still for a long moment afterward. Then slowly, almost without thinking, he opened the final pages of Margaret's notebook. The handwriting changed there. Less steady now. More fragile. Illness hidden between fading lines of ink. "Clara says grief changes shape over time. I think Ethan mistakes responsibility for love. I hope one day my son learns that presence matters more than perfection." Ethan swallowed hard. The words blurred briefly before his eyes. He leaned back slowly in the leather chair while dawn began creeping faintly across the skyline outside. His mother had understood him too well, even at the end, especially at the end. Around 6:30, Ethan finally stood and walked toward the office windows overlooking the city. Thousands of lights still glowed beneath the fading darkness, while traffic slowly returned to the streets below. Somewhere down there, Clara was probably opening the cafe already, starting another ordinary morning while his entire understanding of himself quietly unraveled. He should have gone home. Instead, 40 minutes later, he found himself walking back into Bennett's cafe just after sunrise. The warm scent of coffee wrapped around him immediately. Morning customers filled the small tables now. Construction workers, nurses ending overnight shifts, young professionals typing into laptops, ordinary people beginning ordinary days. Clara stood behind the espresso machine, tying her apron when she noticed him. Surprise flickered briefly across her face again. "Mr. Calloway." Ethan removed his coat slowly. "You can call me Ethan." Clara paused slightly at that, then gave a small nod. "Coffee." He looked toward the corner table near the window. His mother's table. "Tea," he said quietly. Clara prepared it without another word. Ethan watched her carefully while she moved around the cafe. She greeted every customer by name, remembered exact orders before people spoke them, asked an older man about his granddaughter's piano recital, slipped an extra muffin into a nurse's bag with a quiet smile after noticing the woman counting change. Tiny acts. Invisible acts. The kind his world never rewarded because they could not be measured in quarterly reports or stock prices. Clara finally placed the Earl Grey tea in front of him. 1 spoon of honey. Steam curled softly upward between them. Ethan looked down at the cup before speaking. Why did my mother give you medical authorization? Clara's hands stilled against the counter. Around them, spoons clinked softly against ceramic while low conversations filled the cafe. Ordinary morning sounds. But suddenly Ethan felt separated from all of it, waiting quietly for an answer he was not sure he deserved. Clara lowered her eyes briefly. Because she was afraid. Of what? Clara hesitated longer this time. Of dying alone. Ethan felt the words land physically somewhere deep in his chest. Clara continued gently. During her last hospital stay, she asked if you were coming. Ethan looked away immediately toward the rain-streaked windows. Shame moved through him like cold water. He remembered that week clearly now. Singapore meetings. Investors. 3 countries in 4 days. He had sent flowers to the hospital suite worth more than most people's rent. He had believed that counted as care. I called her every night, he said quietly, though the words sounded weak even to himself. Clara nodded softly. Yes. Nothing more. No cruelty. No judgment. Somehow that kindness hurt worse than anger ever could. Ethan stared down at the tea while steam slowly disappeared into the morning air. Was she angry with me? Clara leaned lightly against the counter for a moment before answering. No. Ethan finally looked up. Clara's expression remained calm, but sadness rested quietly in her eyes now. Your mother loved you very much. Then why did she write that letter? Clara glanced toward the small leather notebook resting beside his hand. Because she knew you only slowed down when something breaks. The sentence settled softly between them, true enough to leave no room for defense. Ethan exhaled slowly and looked around the cafe again. For years he had walked through this place, staring only at his phone, treating the people around him like moving scenery. Yet somehow his mother had discovered something here he never noticed. Warmth. Presence. Humanity. Things money could imitate but never buy. Clara reached beneath the counter and placed a folded receipt beside his tea. Ethan frowned slightly. What is this? Your mother's final tab. Ethan unfolded the paper slowly. Total balance due, $0. 00. Beneath it, in Margaret's familiar handwriting, another message had been written carefully in blue ink. The kindest people rarely know how much they matter. Ethan stared at the sentence while the morning light slowly filled the cafe around him. And for the first time in years, the most successful man in Manhattan began understanding how deeply empty success could feel when nobody remembered you as kind. For the next 3 days, Ethan kept returning to Bennett's Cafe without fully understanding why. At first he told himself it was because of his mother, because the cafe still carried traces of Margaret Calloway in the warm scent of tea leaves and the quiet corner table beside the rain-streaked window. But somewhere beneath that explanation lived another truth he was only beginning to face. The cafe made him feel human again. On Thursday evening, soft rain drifted across Manhattan once more as Ethan entered the cafe just after sunset. The dinner crowd had not arrived yet. Only a few customers sat scattered beneath the hanging amber lights, while jazz music floated softly through the room. Clara stood near the pastry case writing inventory numbers into a small notebook. She looked up as the bell above the door chimed. Good evening, Ethan. The sound of his first name in her voice still felt unfamiliar somehow. Personal. Real. Ethan removed his coat slowly. You remembered. Clara smiled faintly. You always come in when it rains now. The observation caught him off guard because it was true. He had not noticed the pattern himself until she said it aloud. Ethan glanced toward his mother's usual table. Clara had placed fresh white flowers there. Simple daisies inside a glass jar. Margaret's favorite. You still set the table for her, he said quietly. Clara adjusted one of the flowers gently. Habit. Ethan studied her carefully for a moment. You miss her. Clara's expression softened almost invisibly. Yes. The honesty in that single word settled quietly between them. Ethan sat down near the window while Clara brought him Earl Grey tea without asking. Outside, headlights reflected across wet pavement while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas through the cold evening air. Inside the cafe, everything felt warmer somehow. Slower. Ethan wrapped both hands around the cup and watched steam curl upward. What was she like here? He asked softly. Clara leaned lightly against the counter while considering the question. Different than she was in magazines. Ethan almost smiled. I think everybody was different than they looked in magazines. Clara nodded once. She liked crossword puzzles. Ethan blinked. My mother hated crossword puzzles. No, Clara corrected gently. She hated losing at crossword puzzles. Ethan stared at her for a second before an unexpected laugh escaped him quietly. Real laughter this time. Clara smiled too. She used to argue with the newspaper every Thursday. Ethan shook his head slowly. I did not know that. I know. Not cruel. Not accusing. Just true. Ethan looked down at the tea again, while silence settled softly between them. Somewhere near the counter, plates clinked quietly, while the espresso machine hissed with warm steam. Ordinary sounds. Yet they seemed to slow the constant noise inside his mind. Why did she trust you so much? He asked after a while. Clara's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the counter. Because I never wanted anything from her. Ethan looked up immediately. Clara met his gaze calmly. Most people around your mother wanted access. Influence. Donations. Invitations. Her voice remained soft but steady. I just talked to her. Ethan leaned back slowly in the chair. The truth in her words felt impossible to ignore. His entire world operated on transactions. Every relationship measured by usefulness. Every conversation carrying hidden expectations. Yet Clara had somehow become important to Margaret precisely because she asked for nothing. She helped you, though, Ethan said carefully. Clara nodded. Yes. How? Clara hesitated briefly before answering. My father passed away when I was 19. Ethan's expression softened slightly. I am sorry. My mother got sick a year later. Hospital bills took everything. Clara glanced toward the dark window beside them. I dropped out of school and started working here. Ethan frowned slightly. What were you studying? Literature. The answer surprised him for reasons he could not explain. Clara noticed his expression and smiled faintly. You thought finance. Something like that. No, she folded her arms loosely. I wanted to teach. Ethan looked at her differently after that. He suddenly tried imagining her somewhere beyond this cafe. Standing in classrooms. Surrounded by books instead of coffee cups. It fit strangely well. My mother paid for your tuition? He asked quietly. Clara shook her head immediately. No, Ethan frowned. But she helped you. She brought groceries sometimes when my mother was too weak to shop. Clara's voice remained calm, though sadness rested gently beneath it now. She sat with her during chemo appointments when I could not leave work. Ethan stared silently. Clara continued softly. Your mother never treated kindness like charity. That was rare. The words settled heavily inside him. Because Ethan suddenly realized he had spent years donating millions of dollars to hospitals and foundations while rarely offering his actual presence to anyone who needed it. Margaret understood the difference. Clara understood it too. Ethan looked around the cafe slowly. The worn wooden floors. The chipped ceramic sugar jars. The old jazz records near the register. Nothing here looked expensive. Yet somehow this small place held more honesty than entire skyscrapers filled with polished executives. There is something else, Clara said quietly after a moment. Ethan looked up. Her expression changed slightly now. More careful. Your mother did not want me to tell you unless it became necessary. Ethan felt tension settle immediately into his shoulders. Tell me what? Clara reached beneath the counter slowly and pulled out a folded hospital visitor badge. Ethan recognized the hospital logo instantly. Manhattan Presbyterian. His mother's final hospital stay. Clara placed the badge gently on the table beside his tea. Visitor name, Clara Bennett. Authorized overnight contact. Ethan stared at the badge while a strange heaviness settled inside his chest again. You stayed with her overnight? Clara nodded once. Sometimes. Ethan's voice lowered almost to a whisper. Where was I? Clara looked at him quietly for several seconds before answering. Usually on another continent. The words were not spoken with bitterness. That made them impossible to defend against. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. Outside, the rain continued falling softly across Manhattan, while somewhere deep inside the warm little cafe, beneath his own office tower, the most powerful man in the room began realizing how small he had become in the moments that mattered most. That night, Ethan did not return to the penthouse overlooking Central Park. Instead, he walked through Manhattan alone beneath cold October rain while the city moved around him in blurs of headlights and reflected neon. No security detail. No driver waiting beside a black SUV. Just a man in a dark coat carrying the weight of truths he should have discovered years earlier. The streets smelled like wet pavement and roasted chestnuts from sidewalk carts shutting down for the night. Somewhere nearby, a saxophone player performed beneath a subway entrance while strangers hurried past without listening. Ethan stopped at a crosswalk and suddenly remembered something Clara had said days earlier. People tell the truth easier to strangers. At the time it sounded thoughtful. Now it felt devastating. Because his mother had apparently spent years telling the truth everywhere except inside her own home. Around midnight, Ethan found himself standing outside Margaret's penthouse apartment for the first time since the funeral. The doorman greeted him quietly before handing over the spare key. Everything inside remained untouched. Soft lamp lights still glowed faintly in the living room from timers his mother had programmed herself. Books rested neatly beside her reading chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat folded near the fireplace with reading glasses balanced carefully on top. Ethan stood silently in the center of the room while grief moved through the space like a living thing. Not loud grief, quiet grief, the kind that lived inside untouched objects and empty chairs. He walked slowly toward the kitchen. A porcelain teacup rested drying beside the sink. Earl Grey. 1 spoon of honey. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Then he noticed something else. On the refrigerator door, beneath a small magnet shaped like Paris, hung a photograph he had never seen before. Clara and Margaret sitting together inside Bennett's Cafe during Christmas. Clara wore a paper crown from a holiday cracker while his mother laughed openly beside her, cheeks flushed with happiness. Ethan stared at the picture for a very long time. His mother looked alive in it. More alive than she ever looked standing beside politicians at charity galas. More alive than during the carefully photographed holidays Ethan scheduled between business trips. He reached up slowly and removed the picture from the refrigerator. Something slipped loose behind it and floated softly to the kitchen floor. A folded letter. Ethan bent down immediately. His name appeared across the front in Margaret's handwriting. Not sealed. Not hidden, simply waiting. Ethan sat slowly at the kitchen table before unfolding it beneath the dim overhead light. Ethan, if you are reading this, then I finally ran out of time before finding the courage to say these things aloud. Mothers are strange creatures. We spend years protecting our children from pain, only to realize too late that comfort can sometimes become its own kind of cruelty. I protected you from loneliness after your father died. I filled every silence with opportunity. Every wound with ambition. And somewhere along the way, I taught you how to succeed without teaching you how to stay. Clara once told me something I have never forgotten. She said people who are afraid of losing others often become experts at staying busy enough not to notice the distance growing between them. I think she was talking about both of us. Ethan stopped reading for a moment. The apartment felt impossibly still around him now. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the sleeping city while his mother's words settled deep beneath his ribs. He continued slowly. I do not blame you for becoming the man the world rewarded you for being. But I do mourn the gentle boy who used to sit beside me during thunderstorms because he thought lightning sounded lonely. Ethan's hand tightened unconsciously around the letter. A memory surfaced suddenly. Age 8. Sitting beside Margaret beneath a blanket fort while rain hit the apartment windows. She read books aloud whenever storms frightened him. He had forgotten that memory entirely until now. Forgotten how soft life once felt before money and expectations hardened everything sharp around the edges. If you want to honor me, the letter continued, then do not build another hospital wing with my name carved into marble. Sit with someone who feels invisible. Listen longer than necessary. Learn the names of people who cannot advance your career. And when you return to Bennett's Cafe, look at Clara carefully. She carries loneliness quietly too. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. His chest ached now in ways no doctor could diagnose. Because for the first time in years, someone had described him honestly instead of admiring him professionally. Around 2 in the morning, he finally stood and walked toward the bookshelf beside Margaret's reading chair. Family photographs lined the shelves in silver frames. Ethan at graduation. Ethan beside world leaders. Ethan cutting ribbons at billion-dollar openings. Smiling everywhere. Present nowhere. Then he noticed one final photograph tucked near the back. Clara standing beside Margaret outside the cafe during snowfall. Both women holding paper cups. Both laughing at something outside the frame. Ethan stared at it while a painful realization settled fully into place. His mother had not replaced him with Clara. She had simply found emotional warmth where she could. Human beings were not designed to survive entirely on admiration, luxury, and scheduled phone calls. They needed presence, attention, time. Things Ethan had spent years outsourcing because he believed efficiency mattered more than intimacy. He sat back down slowly at the kitchen table and looked again at the final lines of Margaret's letter. Success teaches people how to be noticed, but kindness teaches people how to be remembered. Ethan read the sentence twice, then a third time. Outside, Manhattan continued glowing endlessly beyond the rain-covered glass, while inside the silent apartment, a man who once controlled everything finally began understanding the unbearable cost of becoming emotionally absent from the people who loved him most. The following Monday, Manhattan woke beneath clear autumn skies for the first time in weeks. Sunlight spilled across glass towers and crowded sidewalks while steam curled upward from coffee carts on nearly every corner. But inside Callaway Tower, something unusual happened at exactly 8:15 in the morning. Ethan canceled a merger meeting worth $400 million because one of the junior analysts looked exhausted. The conference room fell silent after he said it. 20 executives stared at him in confusion while assistants froze beside glowing presentation screens. Ethan noticed the young analyst gripping a coffee cup with trembling fingers and dark circles beneath her eyes. Normally, he would have ignored it. Normally, he would have continued discussing percentages while another human quietly disappeared beneath pressure. Instead, he closed the file in front of him. "Go home," he said calmly. The young woman blinked in surprise. "Sir, you have not slept properly in days." Ethan gathered his papers slowly. "The company will survive one postponed meeting." Silence filled the room again. Confused silence this time, because powerful men were not supposed to notice things like trembling hands. 20 minutes later, Ethan stood alone inside the executive elevator descending toward Bennett's Cafe. He caught his reflection briefly in the mirrored wall and barely recognized himself anymore. The expensive suit remained the same, the watch, the polished shoes. But something quieter had shifted behind his eyes over the past week. Something less sharp, less unreachable. When he entered the cafe, Clara looked up from arranging fresh pastries inside the display case. Sunlight streamed softly through the windows, turning loose strands of her blonde hair almost gold beneath the morning light. "You are early," she said gently. Ethan glanced at the clock above the counter. "I canceled a meeting." Clara raised one eyebrow slightly. "Should I be worried about the stock market?" A quiet laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Clara smiled faintly in return. The sound felt strange to Ethan still. Natural laughter. Not polite networking laughter exchanged across marble dinner tables. Real laughter that briefly softened the exhaustion he carried everywhere lately. He sat at the corner table while Clara prepared tea nearby. The cafe bustled gently with morning customers, but Ethan noticed details now he once ignored completely. The elderly widower who always folded newspaper pages perfectly before leaving. The nurse who tipped extra every Friday because her younger brother worked 2 jobs. The college student who studied near the outlet because his apartment heating barely worked. Small, invisible lives surrounding him every morning while he spent years staring only at his phone screen. Clara placed the teacup carefully in front of him. "You look tired." Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm porcelain. "I found another letter from my mother." Clara grew still for a moment. Was it difficult to read? Ethan looked down at the tea while steam drifted softly upward. It was honest. Clara nodded once as if she understood exactly what that meant. Outside the cafe window, people hurried beneath bright Manhattan sunlight, while leaves drifted slowly across the sidewalks. For the first time in years, Ethan noticed the season changing. "My mother thought I became emotionally absent," he said quietly. Clara leaned lightly against the counter. "Do you think she was wrong?" Ethan gave a faint, tired smile. "You answer questions with questions. Usually because people already know the truth before asking." He looked at her carefully then. Really looked. Not as a waitress. Not as part of the cafe. As a person. Clara looked tired too. Subtle exhaustion hidden beneath calmness. He suddenly remembered his mother's final line. "She carries loneliness quietly too." "When was the last time you took a day off?" Ethan asked unexpectedly. Clara blinked once in surprise. "Excuse me. A real day off." She looked down briefly while drying a cup. "I do not know. That is not healthy." Clara smiled faintly without humor. Neither is building billion-dollar companies on 4 hours of sleep. Ethan almost argued before realizing she was right. A comfortable silence settled between them afterward while soft jazz drifted through the cafe speakers. Then Clara reached beneath the counter and removed a folded envelope. Your mother asked me to give this to you eventually. Ethan accepted it carefully. Margaret's handwriting again. Smaller now. More fragile. He opened it slowly beneath the warm cafe light. Ethan, if Clara gives you this letter, then it means you finally slowed down enough to notice another human being fully. I hoped for that more than any business achievement you ever gave me. Ethan swallowed hard while continuing. You spent so many years becoming impressive that I worried you forgot how to become gentle. But gentleness matters, Ethan, especially in a world that rewards coldness. His chest tightened quietly. Around him, cups clinked softly while customers talked in low voices, completely unaware that the most powerful man in the building above them was struggling not to fall apart over handwritten letters and ordinary kindness. I think Clara understands loneliness because she survived it without letting it make her cruel. Learn from that. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. Clara pretended not to watch him, giving him privacy even now. Another quiet kindness. She believed in you very much, Clara said softly after a while. Ethan stared out the window toward the crowded streets. I'm not sure why. Clara folded the towel in her hands carefully before answering. Because she remembered who you were before the world taught you to hide it. The sentence settled deeply into the silence around them. Ethan looked down at the tea again, then at the faded photograph tucked inside Margaret's letter. It showed him at 8 years old standing beside his mother in Central Park during winter, both wrapped in oversized scarves while snow fell around them. Ethan looked happy in the picture, open, unafraid of tenderness. He stared at the image for a very long time before finally whispering something he had not admitted aloud in years. I do not think I have been that person for a long time. Clara's eyes softened gently. People do not lose themselves all at once. Ethan looked up slowly. Clara gave him the same calm expression she always carried, but this time he noticed something else beneath it. Hope. Quiet hope. Sometimes, she said softly, they just forget to come back. Winter arrived quietly that year. By early December, soft snow drifted through Manhattan almost every morning, covering sidewalks and fire escapes in pale white silence before the city woke fully. Bennett's Cafe glowed warmly against the cold streets like a small lantern beneath Callaway Tower, its windows fogged gently from fresh coffee and oven heat, while jazz music floated softly through the early hours. And every morning at exactly 7:15, Ethan Callaway walked through the front door, carrying two things he had not carried in years: time and attention. The first few weeks surprised everyone around him. He stopped interrupting assistants halfway through sentences. He learned the names of security guards in the lobby. He started asking employees whether they had eaten lunch instead of asking only about quarterly reports. At first, people assumed it was grief, temporary softness caused by loss. But the changes remained long after the funeral flowers disappeared from his mother's penthouse. One snowy Thursday morning, Ethan entered the cafe wearing a charcoal coat dusted lightly with snowflakes. Clara stood near the register writing the daily specials on a chalkboard. She looked up and smiled the moment she saw him. Not the polite smile she gave customers. A real one. You are late, she said softly. Ethan glanced toward the old brass clock above the counter. 3 minutes. Margaret would have noticed. He smiled faintly while removing his gloves. I know. Clara handed him his tea before he even sat down. Earl Grey. 1 spoon of honey. Steam curled gently upward between them while morning light reflected softly across the windows. Ethan noticed details automatically now. The tired paramedic asleep over untouched coffee in the back booth. The elderly woman reading romance novels near the window because her apartment felt too empty after her husband passed away. The young father quietly cutting pancakes into tiny pieces for his daughter before rushing to work. Invisible lives. Invisible struggles. Margaret had been right. Kindness began with noticing. You are staring again, Clara said lightly while polishing cups behind the counter. Ethan blinked once. At what? People. He looked around the cafe slowly. I spent years not seeing anyone. Clara rested both hands against the counter. And now? Ethan considered the question carefully. Outside, snow drifted softly across the busy Manhattan sidewalks while inside the cafe warmth settled gently around the quiet morning crowd. Now I think everybody is carrying something invisible. Clara smiled softly. That sounds more like your mother. The words no longer hurt the way they once did. Instead, they felt strangely comforting, like grief slowly changing shape into memory instead of punishment. Around noon, the cafe emptied briefly between rushes. Clara sat across from Ethan for the first time without hurrying back to work immediately. Snow continued falling beyond the windows while soft jazz drifted quietly overhead. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Clara nodded once. Why did you stay? She looked confused. Stay where? With my mother. Ethan folded his hands loosely around the warm teacup. Most people would not have spent years listening to someone else's loneliness. Clara grew quiet for a moment before answering. Because she listened to mine too. Ethan looked at her carefully. Clara glanced toward the window while speaking softly. After my mother died, I stopped talking much. Her fingers rested lightly against the porcelain cup in front of her. Grief made everything feel distant. Customers, friends, even myself sometimes. Ethan remained silent. Clara continued gently. Your mother noticed before anyone else did. A faint smile touched her lips now. She started coming in every Thursday because she said lonely people should not eat alone. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like Margaret. Clara looked back at him calmly. The strange thing about kindness is that it usually helps both people. Snowflakes drifted lazily outside, while silence settled softly between them again. Comfortable silence this time. The kind that no longer needed protecting from. Ethan reached into his coat pocket slowly and removed a folded document. Clara frowned slightly. What is that? Something I want your opinion on before I announce it. He handed her the papers carefully. Clara scanned the first page slowly, then looked up in surprise. The Clara Bennett Foundation? Ethan leaned back quietly. Scholarships for hospitality workers, caregivers, janitors, servers. People who spend their lives taking care of everyone else while nobody notices them. Clara stared at the document again. Ethan, I know you do not like attention, he interrupted gently. But my mother believed invisible people deserve to be seen. Clara's eyes softened with emotion she tried quietly to hide. You do not have to name it after me. Ethan shook his head once. Yes, I do. Outside the cafe window, snow continued covering the city in soft white silence, while pedestrians hurried through the cold without noticing the small conversation happening beneath the tower overhead. But Ethan noticed. That was the difference now. He noticed the way Clara blinked quickly when emotional. The way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear while thinking. The way kindness lived naturally inside her without performance or expectation. Things he once would have ignored entirely. Later that evening, after the final customers left and chairs rested upside down on tables again, Ethan stood near the door pulling on his coat. Clara walked him outside beneath the glowing cafe lights. Snow covered the sidewalks completely now, turning Manhattan strangely quiet. Ethan paused beneath the awning before leaving. You know, he said softly. For years I thought success meant becoming unforgettable. Clara looked at him gently. And now? Ethan glanced back toward the warm cafe behind her. Toward the corner table where his mother once sat drinking tea with the waitress he failed to see for half a decade. Now I think being remembered kindly matters more. Clara smiled then. Small, warm, honest. Snow drifted softly between them while taxis moved slowly through the glowing winter streets beyond. And somewhere above the cafe, hidden among the endless lights of Manhattan, Margaret Calloway's lonely son finally found his way back to the part of himself she never stopped believing still existed.